The snow fell in tired spirals, heavy and unhurried, as if even the sky had grown weary of itself. A wind moved through the endless forest, brushing against the iron rails that sliced through the white silence like veins of forgotten steel. In the distance, the rattle of a train approached a hollow sound, not the eager whistle of travel or adventure, but the dull heartbeat of exile. Inside one of its freezing carriages sat men who no longer knew if they were guilty, innocent, or merely unlucky. Their faces were pale, drawn in shadow, and each exhale fogged the air like a ghost escaping the lungs. Someone coughed, another prayed beneath his breath, and somewhere at the back, a young soldier hummed the tune of an old Russian lullaby, the sound trembling between fear and duty. Outside, the world blurred past in a smear of white fields, trees, rivers, each moment erased by snow as quickly as it appeared. No one spoke loudly. The silence of that place demanded obedience. The train was moving north, toward the edge of maps, where the world seemed to end, and the idea of mercy froze to death long ago. Each man wore a tag around his wrist, thin wire biting the skin, stamped with numbers that meant nothing but still replaced their names. Some had been professors, some farmers, others merely neighbors who said the wrong thing in a moment of fatigue. Yet, inside the carriage, all were stripped to the same shape, trembling bodies huddled in rags, chained by the same uncertainty. The wooden boards beneath their feet were slick with frost, and each jolt of the wheels sent a shiver up the spine. The guards, wrapped in thick coats, stood by the doors, rifles dangling lazily, their faces masked not by cruelty but by routine. It was just another convoy to them, another set of men bound for the Gulag, another page in the endless ledger of punishment that the motherland kept with quiet precision. As night thickened, the lamps flickered, shadows stretched and folded like slow smoke. In the corner, an old man whispered a story to himself about his village, about the apple tree that used to bloom outside his window, about how the snow there never felt this cruel. The others listened, not because they cared about the tale, but because it was a voice, a sound that reminded them of living things. When he paused, silence swallowed the carriage again, thick and cold. The train clattered over a bridge, and for a brief moment, the river below reflected the lights of the windows, tiny, flickering stars trembling on black water, then vanished into darkness. Hour after hour passed. Some men drifted into a shallow, shivering sleep. Others stared at nothing, their thoughts wandering to places they would never see again. The air smelled of sweat, iron, and despair. In the faint light, frost formed on their eyelashes, glittering like tiny tears that refused to fall. One prisoner tried to count the seconds between the wheels' clicks, hoping to measure distance, but soon gave up. The rhythm was too steady, too endless. It lulled the mind into surrender. Time no longer moved forward. It just circled inside the carriage like the stale breath trapped within. At dawn, when the first pale glow crept through the cracks, they saw the forest again, a wilderness of birch and pine stretching to infinity. The guard knocked the butt of his rifle against the door, shouting for them to stand. Chains clinked. Bodies rose slowly, stiff and groaning. Outside, the snow was waist-deep, and the cold bit through every layer of cloth like a living thing. One by one, they stumbled out, blinking against the light. The world smelled of resin and frost, and the horizon was nothing but white. Somewhere in that expanse waited the camp, a place where names disappeared, and survival became a quiet act of defiance. As they lined up beside the train, a crow circled overhead, its cry thin and lonely against the empty sky. The soldiers barked orders, counting heads, pushing, adjusting rifles. One prisoner, a boy no older than 20, looked up and tried to smile at the bird, but the cold cracked his lips and blood stained the snow at his feet. The train behind them hissed like a living beast, steam coiling through the trees, then shuddered and began to move away, leaving only silence in its wake. The men watched it disappear, realizing it had taken the last memory of home with it. What remained was the march ahead, through snow that swallowed footprints faster than they were made, toward fences and watchtowers hidden in the distance. The forest watched in stillness, ancient and indifferent, as the line of prisoners vanished into its heart. That morning, the wind carried the faint smell of smoke. Somewhere beyond the hills, the chimneys of the camp were breathing. The prisoners walked through the snow like ghosts returning to a world that had forgotten them. Their chains whispered against the frost, a sound sharp and metallic, echoing off the trunks of the frozen forest. Ahead, the silhouette of the camp rose out of the mist, a sprawl of wooden barracks ringed by barbed wire, the wire glinting faintly in the weak morning light. Guard towers stood at each corner, their dark shapes crowned with searchlights that still burned from the night. A red flag hung limp above the gate, frozen stiff, its color dulled by frost but still bright enough to remind them whose empire they had entered. The gate creaked open, not in welcome but in warning, and one by one the men passed beneath it, each step heavy as though they were walking into their own graves. Inside, the air smelled of wood smoke and rot. The snow was trampled in gray, marked by countless boots that had come before them. Dogs barked from somewhere near the fence, their growls slicing through the cold like blades. A man in a heavy coat waited at the entrance, the camp commandant. His face was square, colorless, carved with lines that might once have been human. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His eyes did the shouting. He glanced down the line of new arrivals, his hands clasped behind his back, the leather of his gloves creaking softly. "You are no longer men," he said finally, his voice low but carrying through the air like the crack of ice. "You are numbers. You are labor. You are the property of the state." The guards moved in quickly. One by one, the prisoners were stripped of whatever they had left: scarves, belts, boots, even the scraps of paper they had hidden close to their hearts. A man tried to hold on to a photograph of his daughter. The guard tore it from his hands and threw it into the snow, where it darkened and vanished beneath a boot. Then came the They were herded into a long wooden shed that smelled of soap and smoke. The floor was slick, and steam rose from barrels of boiling water. Prisoners shouted orders at them, not guards, but fellow inmates, wearing torn uniforms with faded red triangles. Move, wash. Next, the water was scalding, the brushes rough, and the humiliation complete. When they emerged, their clothes were replaced with coarse gray uniforms that smelled of sweat and mildew. On their chests, numbers were stenciled in black paint, already smudged from use. Outside again, they were led to their barracks, long wooden huts lined with bunks stacked 3 high. The walls leaked cold air through every crack. The floor was packed dirt, and the air was thick with the smell of damp wood, unwashed bodies, and despair. Inside, dozens of men sat on the bunks, staring at the newcomers. Some were thin as shadows, their eyes sunken deep into their skulls. Others coughed with the dry rattle of lungs long past healing. No one spoke. Words were a luxury, and warmth was the only currency. The newcomers were given a tin bowl, a spoon, and a scrap of bread that looked like stone. As dusk fell, the camp came alive with routine. A bell rang hollow and distant, and the older prisoners began to line up near the kitchen. The newcomers followed, clutching their bowls like relics. The supper was a thin soup made of cabbage, and a taste so faint it seemed to vanish before it reached the tongue. Yet every drop was precious. Some licked the inside of the bowls, unwilling to waste even the memory of flavor. When one man spilled his soup, he sank to his knees in panic, trying to scoop it from the dirt until another prisoner quietly handed him half of his own. There was no gratitude spoken, just a silent nod, the kind of gesture that kept a man alive a little longer that night. The wind rose again, pressing against the barracks like a living thing. The men lay close together on the bunks, sharing what little heat their bodies could give. Somewhere in the dark, someone cried softly, the sound muffled into his sleeve. Another whispered a prayer, not to be saved, but simply to be remembered. The guards' boots thudded past the walls, and the beam of a searchlight slid across the cracks like a pale ghost searching for movement. In that moment, every breath seemed too loud, every heartbeat too dangerous. Sleep came in fragments, broken by nightmares and the gnawing cold in the middle of the night. A voice rose from one of the bunks, hoarse, cracked, half-dreaming. The old man from the train was muttering again. "There was a garden," he said, his voice trembling. "In spring, the apples bloomed white as snow. My wife used to bake them with sugar and breadcrumbs." His words faded, replaced by the steady sound of someone coughing blood. The others listened in silence. Stories were the last luxury they could afford, and sometimes they traded them like bread, a small, fragile reminder that they had once belonged to another world. When morning came, the bell rang again, sharper, colder. The men were dragged from sleep and lined up outside, shivering in their thin uniforms. Frost clung to their hair and lashes. The guards shouted roll call, counting and recounting, their rifles gleaming in the weak sun. A whistle blew, and the gates opened. Beyond them stretched the frozen wilderness, endless trees, endless snow, endless work. Saws, axes, and picks were handed out. The day's labor had begun. One prisoner stumbled before the line moved, and the nearest guard struck him with the butt of his rifle. He fell face first into the snow and didn't rise. No one stopped to help. The line kept moving. In the Gulag, mercy was a story people told before they arrived. As the column disappeared into the forest, smoke drifted from the camp's chimneys. The sun climbed but gave no warmth. In the distance, the faint echo of metal striking wood began, the sound of survival being measured in splinters and frostbite. Inside the empty barracks, the wind crept through the cracks again, whispering softly through the bunks. It was as if the walls themselves were remembering the countless voices that had passed through before, fading like names scratched into ice, that the old man's bunk was empty. No one asked where he went. In the Gulag, Questions were as dangerous as escape. The forest loomed like a dark cathedral, its pillars made of pine and its silence deeper than prayer. When the prisoners were marched out that morning, the air was so cold it burned their lungs, and the snow creaked underfoot like cracking glass. Their breath came in pale clouds, each one vanishing into the endless white. Around them, the guards trudged through the drifts, rifles slung over their shoulders, faces hidden behind scars, stiff with frost. The prisoners carried saws, axes, and picks, tools that would decide who lived another day and who would be buried beneath the snow before nightfall. The work site was a clearing surrounded by trees so tall that the sky looked like a narrow strip of gray cloth stretched between their crowns. At the sound of the whistle, they began. Wood struck metal, metal struck stone, and soon the air filled with the dull, rhythmic music of labor. The sound was hypnotic, chopping, scraping, grunting, a grim symphony of survival. Frost clung to every tool, making handles slippery, and more than once, a man's numb fingers lost grip, sending the blade tumbling into the snow. The guards shouted from the edge of the clearing, their words carried by the wind, harsh and foreign. Those who slowed down were struck, not out of hatred, but to maintain order. In the Gulag, cruelty was not an emotion. It was procedure. By midday, the sun hung pale and distant, casting no warmth, only a weak silver light. The men's faces were gray with exhaustion. Their breaths came ragged, forming tiny icicles in their beards. The forest floor was littered with fallen logs, some frozen so deep into the ground that no amount of force could move them. Still, the prisoners tried. Their muscles trembled, their backs ached, but they kept working, not because of courage, but because stopping meant punishment or worse. One man collapsed to his knees, his axe slipping from his hands. The guard shouted something and raised his rifle, but another prisoner, tall, hollow-eyed, maybe 40 years old, stepped forward and took the fallen man's tool, striking the log in his place. The guard watched, then turned away. In this place, mercy survived only when no one was looking. Lunch came in the form of a bucket passed down the line, a thin soup of cabbage and barley, lukewarm and nearly tasteless. Each man got one ladleful. Some swallowed it in seconds. Others let it rest in their mouths to feel the illusion of warmth. A few scraped the bottom of the bucket, hoping for something solid, but found only water. Then the whistle blew again, and the forest resumed its slow, rhythmic breathing, chop, drag, stack, repeat. The snow deepened, and the wind shifted, bringing the scent of pine and smoke. A cruel reminder that warmth existed somewhere, just not here. The youngest prisoner, the same boy who had smiled at the crow, worked beside an older man named Mikhail, a former schoolteacher from Leningrad. Between swings of the axe, Mikhail spoke softly, his voice almost lost in the wind. "When the frost comes this strong," he said, "you must breathe through your scarf or your lungs will freeze." The boy nodded, though his scarf was already stiff with ice. "And when your hands stop feeling the handle," Mikhail continued, "it means they're dying. Beat them against your chest, always." His tone was calm, teacher-like, as if he were explaining a lesson in class. In the camp, knowledge wasn't about wisdom anymore. It was about staying alive another sunrise. As the day wore on, the sky turned the color of lead. Snow began to fall again, soft and soundless, coating the men's shoulders and hair until they looked like statues carved from frost. The guards grew impatient. Production was slow, and dusk was coming. They barked orders, their words blending with the rising wind. Somewhere behind the line, a prisoner slipped while dragging a log and fell. His cry was short, the kind of sound that vanished almost before it began. No one turned to look. The guards carried him away, his body limp between them, boots leaving faint trails that the snow quickly erased. The forest swallowed the evidence whole. When the whistle finally sounded for the last time, the men stood motionless for a moment, as if unsure what to do. Their tools hung from their hands like dead weight. Then, slowly, they began the march back to camp. The path was long, winding through drifts that reached their knees. The world was a blur of white and gray, sky and earth merging into one endless void. Somewhere in that void, the faint glow of the camp appeared, the weak promise of shelter that waited behind wire and walls. The men moved toward it, step after step, their shadows stretching across the snow like smudges of ink fading into twilight. When they reached the gate, the guards counted them again. A few numbers didn't answer. No one mentioned it. The wind howled through the barbed wire as the men were herded inside. Supper was another bowl of thin soup, colder this time, followed by a piece of black bread as hard as stone. Some dipped it in the soup to soften it. Others tucked it away under their shirts, saving it for later, for tomorrow. For the moment between hunger and faint hope. Inside the barracks, the air was thick with the smell of smoke and sweat. The stove burned weakly in the corner, its fire barely alive. The men huddled around it, hands outstretched, faces glowing orange in the dim light. The boy sat near Mikhail, his hands trembling from the cold. "Does it ever get easier?" he asked quietly. Mikhail smiled, though the gesture never reached his eyes. "No," he said, "but you learn to pretend it does." He took a small piece of bread from his pocket and broke it in half. "Eat," he said. "You'll need it for tomorrow." The boy hesitated, then nodded. They ate in silence, the sound of chewing almost sacred in the stillness. Outside, the night deepened. The forest stood unmoving, its branches heavy with snow. In the distance, a wolf howled a lonely, haunting note that carried across the plains. The searchlights swept the wire fence in slow, steady arcs, their beams slicing through the darkness. Inside the barracks, men shifted in their bunks, whispering to themselves or to no one at all. Some dreamed of escape, others no longer dreamed at all. The stove crackled softly, its embers glowing like small, stubborn hearts refusing to die. Somewhere near dawn, the boy woke to find frost forming on the inside of the roof. His breath made tiny clouds that shimmered in the dim light. He turned his head and saw Mikhail lying still, his face pale, his lips blue. For a long moment, the boy didn't move. Then, quietly, he reached over and covered the man's hands with his own, trying to warm them, though the warmth would not return. Outside, the bell began to ring again, the call to another day, another march, another endless repetition of cold, hunger, and hope that refused to entirely vanish. The boy stood, his shadow stretching across the frozen floor. He whispered a few words, maybe a prayer, maybe just a name, and stepped outside into the wind. The snow greeted him like an old friend, and the world beyond the wire waited, vast and silent, pretending not to notice. Morning in the Gulag did not arrive with sunlight, because the sun rarely touched that place. It came with the sound of boots thudding on frozen ground, with the clang of iron against metal as the guards struck the barracks doors. The bell echoed through the camp, sharp as a blade cutting through sleep. The prisoners stirred slowly, their breath visible in the cold air. Some groaned, others said nothing, and a few simply stared into space, as if their souls had already left long before their bodies would follow. The air inside the barracks was thick with frost and the faint smell of smoke. Every surface glittered with ice, and the walls moaned softly as the wind pressed against them. They rose in silence, each man moving like a shadow, their movements mechanical, learned through repetition. They rolled their thin blankets, straightened their bunks, and lined up outside even before the second bell. The cold was so deep it stung like fire. The sky hung low, pale and colorless, as if drained of everything living. The guards paced in front of the line, rifles resting on their shoulders, eyes half closed from the monotony of power. Behind the wire fence, the forest stretched endlessly. Watching without pity, breakfast came in a cracked bowl, a spoonful of porridge, so thin it could be mistaken for water. Some prisoners swallowed it in silence. Others stared into it, as though it might show them an answer. Then the work orders were shouted, and groups were divided. Lumber section, quarry section, rail laying, kitchen, and pit. No one chose where they went. The state decided, and that was final. The boy from before, the one who had lost Mikhail, was assigned to the quarry that day. His face pale and eyes hollow but steady. The march to the quarry was long, the snow rising nearly to their knees. Every breath burned. The guards followed on sleds, the dogs trotting beside them, their breath steaming in the frozen air. The prisoners' boots were worn through at the soles. Each step pressed snow into rags wrapped around their feet. Still, no one complained. Complaints were another kind of death, quicker, noisier, and entirely unnecessary. When they reached the quarry, the sight was both magnificent and terrible. A vast wound carved into the earth, its walls glittering with frost. Steam rose from cracks where fires had been lit to loosen the stone. The work began immediately. Hammers struck rock, picks scraped against frozen layers, and the sound of metal on stone filled the air like distant thunder. Dust mixed with snow, settling on their skin like gray ash. The boy swung his hammer again and again, each blow duller than the last. His hands were blistered, his shoulders trembling from exhaustion. But his mind had learned something new, to exist only within the motion. Swing, breathe, lift, repeat. Beyond that, nothing mattered. He didn't think about the past or the future, only about the next breath and the one after that. At noon, the whistle blew for a short break. The prisoners sat on rocks or logs, hunched against the cold, eating their bread in small, slow bites to make it last. One man pulled a sliver of frozen potato from his pocket, a treasure, and shared it with two others without a word. Sharing was dangerous. The guards called it collective theft if caught, but the men shared anyway. Hunger made comrades of strangers. As the day stretched on, snow began to fall again, light at first, then heavier, until it blurred the edges of the world. The men worked through it, swinging their tools in rhythm with the storm. their figures half vanished in the swirling white. The guards retreated to the sleds, huddling beneath their coats, shouting orders through cupped hands. The sound of work grew slower, duller, as exhaustion settled over the quarry like another layer of snow. The boy's arms moved without thought, but inside his head he was far away. He imagined Mikhail's voice, calm and patient, explaining something simple, maybe arithmetic or a line from Pushkin. For a moment, the noise of the Gulag faded, and the memory of a classroom in Leningrad filled his mind, chalk dust, warmth, and laughter. Then the whistle blew again, and the memory shattered like thin glass. By the time the sky began to darken, the quarry looked like a battlefield. Piles of stone lay stacked beside frozen carts, and the men's faces were smeared with dust and ice. When the final whistle sounded, no one cheered. They simply dropped their tools and lined up again, their bodies bent but their eyes dull with endurance. They marched back through the forest in silence, the snow squeaking beneath their boots. The wind followed them, carrying the faint smell of smoke and iron. Somewhere far off, a wolf howled, its voice long and low, as though mourning the living. Back at the camp, the routine repeated itself. Head count, supper, silence. The soup that night was colder than usual, the bread smaller. Still, they ate as though it were a feast. The boy sat near the stove, staring at the flames that refused to rise higher. Across from him sat an older prisoner, a former engineer named Pavel. His beard rhymed with frost. "You worked the quarry," Pavel said, his voice rough but kind. The boy nodded. "How many rocks did you move?" Pavel asked. The boy shrugged. "Enough to stay alive." Pavel smiled faintly. "Then you did more than most." They spoke quietly for a while. Pavel told him that he had been in the camp for 5 years already, though he had stopped counting the days. "Time here doesn't move," he said. "It circles, like the wind. You think tomorrow will be different, but it never is. Only the faces change." The boy listened, staring into the small fire. "Do people ever leave?" he asked. Pavel nodded slowly. "Some, but not the way they came." He didn't need to explain. That night, the wind screamed louder than usual, rattling the roof and shaking the door. Snow found its way through the cracks, falling softly over sleeping men. The boy lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He could feel his heart beating slowly, stubbornly. For the first time, he realized that the camp itself was alive, breathing through its chimneys, whispering through its fences, feeding on time and memory. The Gulag didn't need to kill quickly. It only needed to keep people alive long enough to forget who they were outside. The searchlights swept over the barracks again, painting long shadows across the snow. The boy turned his head and watched it pass, his eyes calm. Somewhere in the darkness, he thought he heard a sound, faint, distant. Maybe it was just the wind. Or maybe it was the memory of Mikhail's voice carried through the frozen air, refusing to disappear completely. The light moved on. The snow kept falling. The camp slept. The camp lived in rhythm, a heartbeat made of bells, boots, and silence. Days blended together until even the sky forgot to change. Yet beneath that rhythm, something fragile still stirred. It began in whispers during the short pauses between work shifts, in glances exchanged when the guards looked away, in the small gestures that no regime could fully extinguish. Hope in the Gulag did not arrive as light. It survived as warmth, brief, faint, but stubbornly alive. The boy had begun to learn that rhythm. His hands had hardened, his shoulders carried weight without shaking, and his mind had grown quiet. But deep inside, a spark remained, a voice that refused to be silenced. It spoke when he saw someone stumble under a log and helped lift it before the guard could notice. It whispered when he tore his bread in half and passed it to the man next to him. Every act of kindness was a secret defiance, a reminder that he was still human, that the cold had not claimed his heart completely. One evening, after the day's work in the quarry, the prisoners returned to find a new face in the barracks, a man with ink-stained fingers and sharp, hollow eyes. He was thin as a rail, his cheekbones sharp enough to cast shadows. Someone whispered that he had been a writer once, from Moscow. His name was Anton. He spoke little, but his presence changed the air around him. That night, while the others slept, the boy watched Anton sit near the stove, his gaze fixed on the dying embers. After a long silence, the man began to speak softly, as though to himself. "They can take your hands, your words, even your breath," Anton murmured, "but not your thoughts. Not if you don't let them." The boy listened in silence, unsure if the words were meant for him. "What did you write?" he asked quietly. Anton smiled faintly. "Stories, poems, words they called dangerous because they made people feel." He reached toward the fire, tracing something invisible in the air. "I used to think words could change the world. Now I think they only remind us that the world can be changed." From that night on, Anton became a quiet teacher of sorts. In stolen moments, between roll calls, during breaks in the forest, after the lights went out, he shared fragments of memory, lines of poetry, half forgotten, stories smuggled from another life. The men listened like children around a fire. In those moments, the barracks transformed. The walls, the frost, the barbed wire, all faded for a breath, replaced by the echo of something human. Even the guards, pacing outside, could not silence that sound. One night, Anton told a story about a city in spring, about streets filled with lilacs and laughter, about a river that glowed gold at sunset. He spoke with such detail that for a moment they could smell the flowers, feel the warmth of sunlight on their faces. When he finished, no one spoke. The silence that followed was sacred. The boy looked around and saw that even the hardest faces were softened, eyes glistening in the firelight. The Gulag had taken everything from them: food, warmth, freedom. But Anton had given them something rarer: memory. The next morning, the guards searched the barracks. Someone had carved a few words into the wood above a bunk. "We still remember." It was nothing more than that. But in the camp, words were dangerous. The commandant ordered punishment. The men were forced to stand outside for hours, snow up to their knees, the wind slicing through their rags. No one confessed. The guards shouted, struck them with rifle butts, demanded the name of the writer. Still, silence held. Even the boy, trembling from the cold, said nothing. It was a victory, small, invisible, but real. Afterward, Anton smiled weakly at the boy. "See," he whispered through cracked lips, "words still matter." That night, the boy found a small scrap of wood under his bunk. With a nail, he scratched one word into it, Mikhail, and hid it beneath the floorboard. It was not rebellion. It was remembrance. Days passed. The snow deepened and hunger sharpened. The men began to measure time not by dates, but by the wear of their boots. The number of times the soup tasted of nothing, the count of nights without dreams. Still, they found ways to fight the silence. One man hummed an old folk tune as he worked. Another whispered the alphabet to himself so he would not forget. Anton kept telling stories, even when his voice weakened. The boy listened, memorizing each word like a prayer. One evening, as the sun died behind the treetops, a rare thing happened: laughter. A guard slipped on the ice near the gate, and one of the prisoners, unable to stop himself, laughed aloud. It was quick, sharp, and full of life. The guard turned, eyes burning, but before he could act, another guard laughed too. For a moment, the tension cracked like ice underfoot. Then it was gone, but the echo of that laugh stayed, ringing quietly in every heart that heard it that night. The boy lay awake, thinking about it. Laughter, in this place, was more powerful than any weapon. It said, "You have not won yet." It said, "We are still here." He closed his eyes and listened to the wind against the walls, the faint breathing of men around him, and the distant hum of the forest. Somewhere beyond the wire and the cold, the world went on, and the thought was both unbearable and beautiful. The next morning, the guards found Anton too weak to rise. His breath came shallow, his face pale as the frost. The doctor's visit was a formality. No one expected him to recover. The boy sat beside him, holding his hand, a hand that once wrote stories, now trembling and still. "Don't let them take your thoughts," Anton whispered. "Not ever." His eyes closed slowly, like a candle flickering out. The boy sat there long after the others had gone, the wind whistling through the cracks, the fire dying to ash. That night, he carved another word into the floorboard beside Mikhail. This one read, Anton. The act felt like a vow. When morning came, the bell rang again, and life in the camp resumed. The same march, the same cold, the same silence. But something had changed. The men moved with a little more steadiness, their eyes clearer. They spoke to each other more often, shared their bread more freely. The rhythm of the Gulag continued, but beneath it pulsed another rhythm, the rhythm of survival, through memory, through story, through the smallest defiance of forgetting. And somewhere beyond the camp, the wind carried a whisper, a sound like words being spoken softly, like the echo of a story still being told. After Anton's death, something invisible settled over the camp, a silence thicker than the snow. It crept into the barracks, into the men's chests, into their dreams. No one spoke his name aloud, but everyone carried it like a scar beneath their skin. The guards never mentioned him again. His absence was just another blank space, another ghost swallowed by the machine. But for the boy, the silence became unbearable. It followed him everywhere, in the swing of the axe, in the crunch of snow under his boots, in the long hours staring at the frostbitten horizon that never seemed to change. He began to lose the sense of time. Days no longer felt like days, only stretches of gray, broken by the same sound, the bell. It rang in the morning to drag them from sleep, at midday to ration the soup, at night to lock them in. The bell ruled them all. Even in dreams, its echo lingered, a cold reminder that nothing belonged to them anymore. Not their time, not their thoughts, not even their sleep. The boy started counting anything, everything, to hold on to the rhythm of being alive. He counted steps from the barracks to the quarry. He counted swings of the hammer. He counted the seconds it took for frost to form on his eyelashes. Numbers became his quiet rebellion. As long as he could count, he could think. As long as he could think, he could remain human. But time in the Gulag was a cruel illusion. One day, a man named Victor collapsed in the snow, his shovel slipping from his hand. The guard shouted, kicked him, but Victor did not move. They left his body by the path until the shift ended. When the prisoners marched back at dusk, the boy saw a new face in Victor's place. Another man, same number stitched to his uniform. It was as if the camp had erased Victor completely. Even the snow where he had fallen was smooth again. The realization terrified the boy. In this place, death was not an event. It was routine. At night, he began to hear whispers, not from others, but from his own mind. Memories twisted into fragments. His mother's voice, Anton's stories, the crack of the guard's boots. Sometimes he would wake and not remember where he was. Once, he thought he was home again, his father lighting a candle, his sister laughing. But then the candle's flame became the frost's white glare, and he saw the wooden bunks instead of his bed. He buried his face in his arms and did not move until dawn. The guards had a name for those moments, when a prisoner's mind broke the silence. They said it came for everyone eventually, some after years, some after weeks. The signs were always the same: the quiet stares, the vacant smiles, the sudden laughter with no sound. The boy saw it first in an old miner named Sergei. One day, Sergei stopped speaking altogether. He would sit near the stove, staring at the wall as if watching something no one else could see. One morning, he walked out of line during roll call and began walking toward the fence. No one tried to stop him. The guards didn't even raise their rifles until the last second. The shot echoed across the camp, and then just silence. That night, no one mentioned Sergei, but everyone felt the weight of his choice. To step beyond the fence was madness or freedom, maybe both. The boy couldn't decide which was worse, dying like Sergei or living like a shadow. Winter deepened. The cold no longer bit. It simply consumed. Skin cracked, lips bled, and even the guards seemed to move slower. The boy's hands were swollen, his fingernails black from frostbite. The soup thinned until it was more water than meal. Every movement hurt, every breath scraped like sand. But what frightened him most was not the pain, it was the numbness that followed. One night, lying on his bunk, he realized he hadn't felt anything in days. Not fear, not hunger, not grief, just emptiness. He stared at the wooden ceiling and thought, so this is how they win. They don't need to kill you. They just make you forget what life feels like. The next morning, the boy decided he wouldn't let that happen. He didn't know how, only that he had to try. When the men marched to the quarry, he looked up at the sky for the first time in weeks. It was pale blue, the color of frozen glass. A single crow circled above, black wings cutting through the light. It was the first living thing he had seen in months. For a second, he imagined what it would be like to be that bird, to fly beyond the wire, beyond the snow, into a world where no one counted the hours. The thought stayed with him all day. That night, while the others slept, he took out the small piece of wood he had hidden beneath the floorboard, the one with Anton's name. Using a nail, he scratched another line beside it. Crow. It was a memory, a symbol, a promise that his mind still worked. Each word carved beneath that floorboard was a heartbeat. Each name a pulse in the dark days turned into weeks. The boy's body weakened, but his mind held on. He began to whisper stories to himself, not to the others, but into the air. Simple things: a field after rain, the smell of bread, his mother's hands, the sound of laughter. He repeated them again and again until they became like prayers. Words had saved Anton once. Maybe they could save him too. One afternoon, during work in the quarry, a guard slipped again on the ice, the same way one had before. The boy almost smiled. This time no one laughed, but the moment still felt alive, like a memory refusing to die. The guard's curse echoed across the pit, rough and angry, but to the boy, it sounded almost human. Even cruelty, he realized, was proof that the world still existed. When night fell, the wind rose, howling through the camp like a wounded animal. The barracks shuddered. Men coughed, turned in their sleep. The boy lay awake, counting each gust. The cold found its way beneath the blankets, beneath the skin. Yet, even in that darkness, he felt something stirring inside, a defiant heartbeat. He whispered into the dark, "I remember." The words felt heavy, sacred. Outside, the wind carried them away. Maybe no one would ever hear them. Maybe that didn't matter. The act itself was survival. To remember that was rebellion enough. The next morning, the bell rang again, as always. The men rose, silent, their breath white in the air. The boy stepped outside and looked toward the horizon. The crow was gone, but its shape still lingered in his mind, black wings against the pale sky. He clenched his fists, feeling the rough fabric of his gloves against his skin. He was still here. He was still himself, and for now, that was victory. The wind no longer felt like weather. It was a presence, something alive, whispering through the wire and snow, as if mocking the men who could not follow it. Days had folded into each other until memory itself began to blur. But for the boy, one thing stayed sharp: the thought of distance. Not escape exactly, not in the foolish way new prisoners sometimes imagined, but distance itself, a stretch of open land, untouched by commands, by numbers, by bells. He didn't even want freedom. He wanted silence without fear. That dream began to take shape one evening when the camp was unusually quiet. The guards drunk on stolen vodka, their laughter bleeding through the night like the echo of another world. The boy sat near the stove with two others, an old man named Yuri, who had been a teacher before the arrest, and a mechanic called Petrov, whose eyes were the pale gray of frozen rivers. They spoke in low voices, their words weaving between breaths of steam from the soup pot. Petrov had found something, a loose board, near the storage shed where the frost didn't reach the ground. Beneath it, he said, was a narrow space, a forgotten crawlway leading toward the forest side of the fence. It was nothing, maybe a rumor, but even a rumor was oxygen. The boy listened, his heart steady but awake. Yuri warned that talk of escape was suicide, yet, even as he said it, his hands trembled with the same dangerous hope. Outside, the snow fell like ash, endless and indifferent. That night, the boy couldn't sleep. He lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling where frost crystals shimmered in the lantern light. The thought of open space burned inside him. Not of running. He knew the forest was death, but of standing somewhere that was not watched, not numbered. He imagined walking until the sound of boots faded behind him, until the air felt human again. In the days that followed, the rumor spread quietly. Men who had forgotten how to hope began to whisper again. Each night, they glanced toward the shed, pretending not to. Even the guards seemed to sense it, pacing more often, their rifles clutched tighter. The boy kept working, kept counting steps, pretending not to dream, but the dream grew. It lived in the rhythm of his hammer, in the faint warmth of his breath, in the rare smile of another prisoner. Then, one morning, it happened an accident that set the rumor ablaze. A section of the fence near the far end had collapsed under the weight of snow. For hours, the guards struggled to repair it, shouting orders, dragging wire. In that brief window, the camp felt different, off balance, uncertain. The boy saw it in everyone's eyes, the unspoken question, what if? That night, as the men returned from work, the boy caught Petrov's glance. No words, just a look, sharp and quick. It said, tonight. He felt his chest tighten. He hadn't agreed to anything, but when darkness came, his body moved on its own. He followed Petrov through the shadows between barracks. His breath, they crouched near the storage shed. Petrov pried up the board with a quiet groan. Beneath it, a narrow tunnel gaped like a wound in the frozen earth. The air that rose from it was damp and bitter. The boy hesitated. It won't work, he whispered, but Petrov smiled faintly. Nothing works here, he said. That's why we try. They crawled inside. The earth was close, choking, pressing against their shoulders. The boy's hands sank into mud. His breath came short. Behind him, Yuri followed, muttering prayers under his breath. The tunnel smelled of rot and rust, but it was movement forward, away. After what felt like hours, they reached a place where the soil gave way to faint moonlight filtering through the boards above. The boy peered through a crack and saw the forest black, vast, infinite. His heart pounded. Freedom was a few steps away, but before he could move, a sound broke the silence. Boots, distant but steady. A flashlight beam swept across the snow. Petrov froze. Yuri stopped breathing. The boy's pulse roared in his ears. The beam came closer, then paused, then moved on. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Petrov exhaled softly. Another time, he whispered. They crawled back, slow and silent, sealing the board behind them as if nothing had ever happened. When they returned to the barracks, no one spoke. But something had shifted. Even though they hadn't escaped, the dream had touched the man that was more dangerous than running. The boy lay awake for hours, his heart still racing, not from fear, but from the memory of the open air, of seeing trees without barbed wire between them. He realized that in that single breath of freedom, he had felt more alive than in all his years before. The next morning, the guards seemed nervous. Someone must have seen movement. They searched the shed, shouted questions, hit a few men, but found nothing. Life returned to its rhythm, yet beneath it, something throbbed, a pulse of quiet rebellion. Petrov caught the boy's eye at breakfast. "We were outside," he whispered. The boy didn't reply, but inside he repeated the words again and again. We were outside. It became a mantra, a truth stronger than hunger, stronger than pain. The Gulag had no bars strong enough to cage the mind once it had seen the sky. Over the next days, the rumor of the failed escape grew into legend. Some said they had reached the forest. Others claimed they had seen wolves waiting for them. It didn't matter what was true. What mattered was that people believed someone had gone beyond the fence. Hope, once born, couldn't be buried again. And for the first time in months, the boy smiled not because he was happy, but because he understood that even in this frozen hell, the human spirit had ways to fight. Sometimes it was through stories, sometimes through laughter, and sometimes through a single glance at the endless horizon. The whistle tore the morning apart, a single note of terror slicing through the frozen air as men stumbled from their bunks, half awake, half afraid, their breath rising like smoke in the dim gray light. The guards shouted orders, rifles in hand, dogs barking as if they could smell guilt in the air. Within minutes, the prisoners stood in formation outside, lined up in the biting wind, their thin coats useless against the cold. Snow fell in quiet flakes, but it felt like ash, heavy and slow. The commandant arrived last, his coat black against the pale world, boots crunching with deliberate rhythm. He didn't speak at first. He walked down the line, his eyes scanning each face as though searching for a spark of defiance. When he finally stopped, his voice was calm to calm. "Someone tried to leave," he said, letting the words hang in the air. "Someone forgot that there is no leaving here." The silence that followed was unbearable. The boy kept his eyes down, the snow blurring his vision. No one moved. The commandant signaled to his guards. 2 men were dragged forward, Petrov and Yuri. The crowd gasped softly, though no one dared to speak. The boy's heart twisted in his chest. Petrov's face was swollen, blood crusted on his lip, but his eyes, those gray, unbroken eyes, still burned with something wild and alive. Yuri looked smaller than ever, his hands trembling, his body swaying in the wind. The commandant turned to the prisoners. "When one dreams," he said, "all suffer." He nodded, and the guard struck. The sound of the first blow was dull, final. The boy flinched, but he didn't look away. He forced himself to watch as Petrov fell, then rose, then fell again, his breath ragged but his spirit unbroken. Yuri collapsed beside him, coughing blood into the snow. The guards laughed. It was a performance, a reminder of power, of control. Every man watching understood this was what hope cost. When it was over, the commandant wiped his gloves clean and spoke again. "This camp exists because the world forgets," he said. "Remember that, and you live." Then he turned and walked away, his boots leaving perfect black prints across the white field. The guards dragged the bodies back toward the infirmary. The boy couldn't move. His legs felt frozen to the ground, his chest hollow. Petrov's blood had stained the snow near his boots, a small, dark circle that spread slowly like ink in water. That image burned into his mind, deeper than any words could. Later, in the barracks, no one spoke. The silence was a living thing, thick and suffocating. The boy lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. The boards creaked with the cold, and he thought about Petrov's last glance before the guards took him away. It hadn't been fear, it had been peace, a kind of quiet acceptance. Maybe, the boy thought, Petrov had already escaped before they ever caught him. The body could die here, but the mind, if it stayed pure, if it refused to bend, might still find freedom. That idea filled him with something he hadn't felt in months: purpose. That night, He crept to the small space beneath his bunk, pulled up the loose board, and took out the wooden piece he had carved before. The names were there, carved with care: Mikhail Anton Crow. He added a fourth, Petrov. The letters trembled beneath his fingers. He whispered the names softly, one by one, like a prayer. The act felt dangerous, sacred. Outside, the wind howled like the ghosts of the lost, rattling the walls, but he kept whispering. In that soundless world of obedience, his voice, though small, felt enormous. The next morning, the guards forced everyone to work double shifts. No one spoke, but eyes met in secret. Every man knew the truth. Now freedom was not measured by miles, but by memory. Petrov had shown them that. Even the guards seemed uneasy, their laughter forced, their steps uncertain. The commandant watched from the tower, his figure framed against the gray sky, motionless as a statue. The boy kept his head down, but inside, something in him burned steady, quiet, unstoppable. He began to collect moments, again small things, the shape of a cloud, the way frost glowed pink at sunrise, the sound of boots crunching snow in perfect rhythm. These became his resistance, his rebellion. That night, as he lay awake, he thought about the forest beyond the wire. He could still see it in his mind, black and endless, whispering secrets to the wind. He didn't know if anyone would ever escape, but he knew one truth: they couldn't erase the dream. It lived now in every man who had seen that glimpse of open space, every man who remembered Petrov's eyes. The Gulag could bury bodies, but not memory. And as long as someone remembered, they hadn't won. The boy awoke before dawn, though he hadn't really slept. The barracks were quiet, filled with the sound of slow breathing and the soft creak of frost settling into the wood. Outside, the sky was a faint bruise of gray and violet, and the cold pressed against the thin walls like a living thing. He rose silently, careful not to wake the others, and looked through the small slit of glass that served as a window. The camp was still a world of shadows and silence, the guard tower lights blinking like tired eyes. He watched the snow drift across the wire fence, the wind tracing ghostly patterns on the ground, and he thought of Petrov again, of the blood that had melted into the ice and then disappeared. For days, that image had haunted him, but now it did something else. It moved him. Petrov's courage had not died. It had become a part of him, a pulse beneath the fear, a quiet rhythm that refused to stop. When the morning horn blared, he felt strangely calm. The line outside was longer than usual, the prisoners slower, their bodies bent with exhaustion. The guards barked at them, swinging rifles like clubs, but the boy no longer flinched. His thoughts were elsewhere, somewhere far beyond the fence. They marched toward the forest, to the same clearing they had worked for months, cutting down trees until their hands cracked and bled. The rhythm of the axes was hypnotic. He could feel the pulse of it in his bones. Around him, the men worked like machines, silent, broken, moving because not moving meant death. But in that numbness, something began to change. The boy noticed the small ways they helped each other, the older man who shielded another from the guard's gaze, the one who passed a crust of bread when no one was looking, the hand that reached out when a body collapsed. These were not grand acts of rebellion, but they were defiance all the same. Humanity still lived here, buried beneath the ice, waiting for someone to remember it. That thought gave him strength. By midday, the sun appeared a pale, distant circle, but it felt like a miracle. The boy paused, letting the light touch his face, and for a moment, he imagined he was somewhere else, somewhere warm, somewhere free. The guard shouted. The moment shattered, and the boy went back to work, but the warmth lingered inside him like a secret. That night, after roll call, he sat in the corner of the barracks, whispering the names again. This time, another man heard him, an older prisoner named Ilyin, who had been in the camp longer than anyone could remember. His face was weathered, his eyes dull but kind. "What are you saying, boy?" he asked quietly. The boy hesitated, then whispered, "Names of the ones we lost." Ilyin's eyes softened, a shadow of something like pride crossing his face. "Keep saying them," he said. "Names are dangerous here. That's why they fear them." From that night, the boy became a keeper of names. Men would whisper to him before lights out, giving him the names of the dead, the disappeared, the forgotten. He carved each one into the wood beneath his bunk, careful and steady, until the space was filled with lives. It became a secret monument, unseen but unbreakable. Weeks passed, and the boy began to notice how the guards changed too. They grew restless, paranoid, sensing that something invisible had shifted among the prisoners. Whispers moved through the camp like smoke about stolen tools, hidden notes, strange signs carved into the trees near the fence. The boy didn't know if any of it was true, but he wanted to believe it. Hope had a way of spreading, even in silence. One night, a blizzard hit, the worst they had seen all year. The wind screamed through the cracks, snow pouring through the gaps in the walls, and the guards huddled in their quarters while the prisoners fought to stay warm. In the chaos, the boy saw his chance. He gathered the men closest to him, the ones who still listened, still dreamed, and spoke softly. "If they take our bodies," he said, "we still have this. The names, the memories. That's how we live." The others nodded, eyes glinting in the dark. It wasn't an escape plan, not in the way Petrov had tried. It was something deeper, more dangerous. It was the decision to remember. In the Gulag, memory was rebellion. When morning came, the blizzard had buried everything under white silence. The guards shouted, angry and confused, as if the snow itself had betrayed them. The boy looked out and saw the world renewed, blank and endless. For the first time, he didn't feel trapped. He felt part of something larger, something unbreakable. He realized then that the fire burning in his chest wasn't hope, it faith in what could not be destroyed. The first sign came not from the guards, but from the wind. It had changed, somehow no longer a whisper, but a murmur that carried strange sounds from beyond the forest, like distant thunder buried beneath miles of snow. The prisoners noticed it first, because they noticed everything. When you lived each day on the edge of death, you learned to hear things others ignored: the sigh of shifting ice, the creak of wood under weight, the faint crack in a guard's voice that meant he was afraid. The boy stood at the worksite, his shovel biting into the frozen earth. When he heard it, a low rumble that rolled through the air like a sleeping giant turning in its bed. He looked up sharply, breath forming white clouds before his face. Across the clearing, others had stopped, too, axes hanging motionless, eyes fixed on the horizon. The guards shouted for them to keep working, but even they hesitated for a heartbeat, the sound pressing against their nerves like unseen pressure. Then it was gone, swallowed by the wind, leaving behind an uneasy silence that clung to the skin like frost. That night, the whispers began. Some said it was a storm coming. Others swore it was artillery, the start of another war. The older men shook their heads. "The world outside never changes," one muttered. "Only the names of those who command it." But the boy could not let it go. The sound had reached something deep inside him, something that refused to stay buried. It was as though the world had spoken for the first time in months, a reminder that life still moved beyond the barbed wire. Days passed, but the air felt charged, brittle with tension. The guards grew meaner, their faces drawn tight, as if fearing what they couldn't understand. They doubled the roll calls, beat prisoners for standing too slow, laughed too loud, or staring too long. Every act of cruelty felt sharper, more desperate. The boy began to see it clearly. Now their power wasn't strength. It was fear disguised as authority. Even their boots sounded different on the frozen ground. Quick, uneven, uncertain. One afternoon, while they hauled logs through knee-deep snow, the boy saw one of the guards drop his cigarette. His hands shook as he picked it up, eyes darting toward the forest. It struck the boy then the guards were prisoners too, bound by obedience and terror. The realization was strange, almost comforting. If fear ruled everyone, then maybe courage could belong to anyone. Then, one bitter morning, a new commandant arrived. He was young, tall, with pale eyes that reflected nothing. His uniform looked too clean for this place. He moved with precise calm, his expression unreadable. He didn't yell or curse. He didn't need to. His silence did the work. He inspected the men like cattle, his gaze steady, and when he finally spoke, it was quiet, measured. "Order," he said, "is the only mercy you'll know." From that day, the camp fell into an even colder rhythm. The prisoners learned to fear his stillness more than the guards' rage. The boy watched him often, studying his every move. There was something in the way he looked at the world as if he, too, was waiting for it to break, and then it did. It happened without warning, in the dead of night. The kitchen caught fire. The boy woke to the smell of smoke, sharp and strange, and within seconds, the barracks erupted into shouts. The guards burst in, ordering everyone outside, their torches flickering wildly. The sky glowed orange, the snow shimmering gold. Flames devoured the roof of the kitchen building, licking high into the wind. Sparks scattering like stars, escaping captivity. The air was alive with heat and ash, a cruel beauty that made the boy's chest tighten. The guards scrambled with buckets of icy water, shouting orders no one obeyed. The fire was beyond control. It fed on the wind, on the wood, on the hunger that had lived too long in silence. The boy stood with the others, watching the inferno paint the night. And for the first time in his life, he saw something in this camp that wasn't gray or dead. It was destruction, yes, but it was alive. Ilian came to stand beside him, the glow reflecting in his hollow eyes. "Do you see?" the old man murmured. "Even in this frozen place, something can still burn." The boy didn't answer, but he felt it. The warmth touched his face like a forgotten memory. When dawn came, the camp was unrecognizable. The air still smelled of smoke and ash. Half the kitchen was gone. The storehouse, too. The guards looked exhausted, their eyes hollow, their voices rough. The new commandant stood among the ruins, motionless. His pristine uniform was stained with soot, his gloves darkened by ash. He spoke little that morning, but his silence was dangerous. The boy could feel the rage simmering beneath it. By midday, the beatings began. Men were dragged out, questioned, accused of sabotage. Some were taken to the pit and never returned. The boy watched with clenched fists as his friend, the old carpenter, was beaten for hiding tools he'd never touched. Yet even through the pain, the man's eyes burned steady. It was the same look Petrov had worn before his death. The boy realized what had changed. The fire had burned more than wood, and records it had burned the illusion of control. The guards were afraid now, not of the prisoners, but of what the fire meant. It had proven that even in a place built to crush life, chaos could still rise. That night, under curfew, the barracks were filled with silence, thicker than smoke. No one spoke, but eyes met in the dark. The boy lay awake, heart pounding, as he heard footsteps outside, guards patrolling, muttering about the new commandant's rage. He reached beneath his bunk to the secret board and ran his fingers over the carved names. They felt like a heartbeat beneath the wood. There was barely room left, but he began carving again, slow and careful. When he finished, a single new word gleamed in the dim light: tomorrow. He stared at it for a long time, tracing the letters again and again. It was not hope, it was defiance. Tomorrow meant that something still existed beyond the barbed wire, something they could not steal or kill. The next morning, the camp moved like a machine trying to fix itself. The guards barked new orders, replaced burnt structures with makeshift tents, rationed food that barely existed. The commandant walked among them like a ghost, his silence heavier than thunder. But something in the air had shifted. The prisoners stood a little straighter, moved a little slower, eyes less empty. They had seen what the guards had seen the system could burn. Even the snow couldn't hide the black scars on the ground, reminders that the world was not invincible. The boy carried that image with him, the orange reflection still dancing behind his eyes. He felt it in the rhythm of every shovel, every heartbeat. The Gulag was not eternal. Nothing built on fear ever was. When night fell again, the stars were clearer than he had ever seen them. He stood by the fence, pretending to relieve himself, and looked up. For months, he had forgotten the sky existed. Now, it stretched vast and endless, an ocean of frozen fire. He thought of the men who had died here: Petrov, Mikhail, Antonand, whispered their names to the wind. He imagined their souls floating in that endless dark, free at last. Then he whispered one more word, a promise that no guard could hear: soon. The days after the fire were like living inside a wound that refused to heal. Smoke still clung to the air, faint and bitter, the charred smell of burned wood mixing with sweat and iron. The snow that had fallen since could not hide the black scars across the ground. Every corner of the camp carried a whisper of what had happened, though no one dared to speak aloud. The guards had become different, tighter, quicker to strike, their eyes darting even when nothing moved. They were afraid of ghosts, of what they could not see or name. Every day began with searches. Every night ended with questions. The prisoners were lined up more often now, forced to stand for hours in the freezing dark while the commandant walked slowly past them, his breath steady, his gloved hands clasped behind his back. He did not shout. His silence was heavier than any voice. When he stopped, everyone stopped breathing. One by one, he looked at their faces, as if searching for the flicker of guilt. And then he moved on, leaving the snow stained with frost and fear. The boy kept his eyes down, as always, but something inside him had changed. The fire had burned away his submission. He worked, obeyed, endured, but beneath it all, something alive had begun to grow again. At night, when the guards finally left the barracks, he whispered the names under his breath, not just of the dead, but of the living, each name a spark against the dark. Ilyan listened beside him, nodding silently, the corners of his cracked lips curling into the ghost of a smile. "Keep them alive," he whispered. "That's how we win." The boy didn't understand what victory could mean in a place like this, but he understood survival. The days blurred together, a rhythm of hunger and cold. Yet now there was an undercurrent of something else, a pulse beneath the ice. It began with glances shared in silence, small acts of defiance, too tiny to punish. Bread passed hand to hand beneath the table, a tool hidden instead of returned. A name scratched into a wall where only moonlight could reach. Each act was a breath, and together they made something that almost felt like life. The guards sensed it. Their punishments grew random, their fear leaking through their anger. The boy saw it clearly now, how cruelty trembled when it realized it was no longer believed. The new commandant paced the yard each evening, his boots leaving perfect lines in the snow, his shadow long and sharp against the floodlights. Sometimes he stopped by the wire fence and stared out toward the forest, the wind tugging at his coat. The boy wondered what he thought about in those moments. Did he ever dream of leaving too? Or had this place become his prison as well? One morning, the horn did not blow. The prisoners woke in confusion, the usual rhythm broken. When the guards finally came, their faces were pale, their voices clipped. Something had happened beyond the fence. Rumors spread like wildfire. Another camp nearby had revolted, guards killed, fences cut. Some said soldiers were coming, others whispered of executions. The boy listened and felt his pulse quicken. The world beyond the barbed wire was moving again. That night, the commandant gathered them all in the yard. Snow fell in heavy flakes, muffling every sound but his voice. "You will forget what you've heard," he said. "You will work, you will eat, you will sleep, and you will not think. Those who do will be dealt with." He turned his back and walked away, the guards following like shadows. But the order came too late. Once a man begins to think, no order can stop him. The cold deepened. January sank its teeth into every wall, every body. The boy's fingers cracked, his lips bled, his breath froze into tiny crystals that clung to his scarf. The snow was endless, blank, merciless. Yet inside the barracks, warmth flickered in quiet corner stories whispered after lights out. Laughter that sounded foreign and forbidden. Ilyan told tales of cities that once existed, of rivers that didn't freeze, of summers that smelled like grass instead of rot. The boy listened in silence, his eyes closed, seeing it all in his mind. "They can take everything," Ilyan said softly, "but not what we remember." One night, a young man named Pavel slipped something under the boy's blanket, a small scrap of paper, rough and smudged. On it was a drawing, scratched in charcoal. It showed the camp's outline, the guard towers, the fence, and beyond it, the forest. "It's just a dream," Pavel whispered. "But dreams are all we have." The boy hid it under the plank, beside the carved names. He stared at it in the dark, heart pounding. Escape was impossible. They all knew that. Yet now, even the idea of a dream felt dangerous, powerful. Days stretched into weeks. The guards' anger grew brittle, the commandant's patience thinner with every passing dawn. He stopped speaking to the men altogether, retreating into his office, where the windows were always dark. The boy saw less of him now, but his absence was worse than his presence. It meant something was coming. One evening, as they returned from work, a group of soldiers entered the camp, different uniforms, colder eyes. They brought orders from Moscow, papers stamped in red. The commandant read them silently, then looked at the prisoners with an expression that was almost human. "Half of you will be moved," he said, "tomorrow." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Moved where? No one knew, but the look in the guards' eyes said enough. Some were already dead. They just hadn't been buried yet. That night, no one slept. Men clung to what little they had: photos, scraps of letters, bits of memory carved into wood. The boy didn't pack. He had nothing to take but his secret carvings, his names, his word, tomorrow. He sat awake beside Ilyan, who stared at the ceiling with eyes that no longer blinked. "Whatever happens," the old man whispered, "you keep the names. Promise me." The boy nodded, his throat too tight for words. Morning came like a blade. The soldiers barked orders, dividing the men into groups. Snow fell harder, covering the tracks before they were even made. The boy watched as friends were pushed toward trucks, their faces blank, resigned. Ilyan stood beside him, trembling. When the guard called his number, he didn't move. "Go," the boy whispered, but Ilyan shook his head. "No," he said softly, "I stay here. I finish my story." Before the boy could speak again, the guards pulled him away. The old man's thin frame vanished into the blur of snow, swallowed whole. The trucks rumbled, engines growling, black smoke curling into the gray sky. The boy stood motionless long after they were gone, his breath shallow, his hands trembling against his chest. Something inside him cracked open, not fear this time, but something larger, something bright and unbearable. He realized that even if he survived, the camp would never leave him. It had become part of his blood, his memory, his silence. But he also knew something else, now something the guards could never understand. The camp wasn't forever. It could end. Everything could, even the ice. That night, he took the scrap of paper from its hiding place. The lines of Pavel's drawing glowed faintly in the candlelight. The fence, the towers, the forest. He stared at it until the shapes blurred, until they looked like veins across a frozen heart. He folded it once, twice, and pressed it against his chest. "Tomorrow," he whispered again, and felt the word echo inside him like a prayer. The trucks rolled into the darkness like beasts made of smoke and steel, their engines echoing through the frozen forest until the sound became part of the wind itself. The boy sat in the back of one, squeezed between men who no longer had names, only numbers stitched across their chests. Every bump of the road rattled through his bones. Snow slipped through the cracks in the canvas roof, melting against their faces, turning to ice before they could wipe it away. No one spoke. Even the guards riding beside them seemed afraid to make noise, as if words might draw something terrible from the night. Hours passed, like years. The boy tried to count the turns, to measure the distance in his head. But the road twisted endlessly, climbing and sinking, vanishing into fog. Somewhere behind them, the camp was disappearing. The fences, the towers, the carved names. He imagined Ilyin sitting in the barracks, the firelight flickering across his hollow face, waiting for a dawn that would never come. He pressed the map against his chest, the paper warm from his skin, and whispered the old man's words, "Keep the names alive." The truck jolted to a stop. A soldier pulled back the canvas, shouting for them to move. Blinding white light flooded the inside. The boy blinked and stepped down into the snow. Before him stretched another fence, taller than the first, its wires glinting under surface. The new camp was smaller, quieter, a place that seemed built for vanishing. They were herded inside, counted, divided, and assigned to barracks that smelled of mold and rust. The boy's new bed was a plank beneath a broken window. Cold wind cut through the cracks, biting his skin until it felt like glass. Around him, the other prisoners settled into silence. Their faces were gray, their movements slow, as if time itself had thickened in the air. Days turned into weeks again. Work began before dawn, ended long after. They carried logs, shoveled snow, dug trenches in frozen ground that screamed beneath their shovels. The guards here were different, stricter, quieter, with no trace of pity in their eyes. The commandant of this place was a tall man with a scar running from his temple to his jaw. He never raised his voice, never looked anyone in the eye. Yet everyone feared him more than the ones who shouted. The boy watched him from a distance and saw something strange. He limped slightly, as though the past had left its mark somewhere deep in his bones. Once, when the boy stumbled, carrying wood, the man stopped beside him, stared for a long moment, and said only one word, "Stand." The tone was neither cruel nor kind, but it sank into him like a command from something larger than life. He stood, he kept standing. The nights grew colder. Sometimes the boy dreamt of fire, the one that had destroyed the kitchen, the faces that vanished in the smoke. He woke with his hands trembling, the ghost of warmth fading from his skin. The forest beyond the fence whispered with life, the kind of silence that wasn't empty but full of unseen movement. Wolves, maybe, or freedom itself. One evening, while cleaning tools in the yard, the boy noticed something strange. One of the fence posts near the far corner had loosened at its base. Not enough to crawl under, but enough to make the wires shift slightly in the wind. He didn't tell anyone. He just looked, memorized the spot, and walked away. The thought grew roots in his mind. That night, he couldn't sleep. He took out the map again, its edges worn soft from being folded too many times. The lines made no sense. Here the forest stretched differently. The road turned the wrong way, but it didn't matter. The paper wasn't a plan, it was a promise. And promises were the only things left that could not be taken. Days later, while hauling supplies near the outer fence, the boy met Pavel again. Somehow, he had survived the transfer to Thinnerno, his eyes sunken but still bright with that dangerous glint of imagination. When he saw the boy, he grinned faintly, like someone remembering a secret they'd buried long ago. "Still got it," he whispered as they passed each other. The boy nodded once. "Good," Pavel said, "because soon we'll need it." That night, the boy found a mark scratched into the wall near the stove, 3 small lines. then one long line through them. A signal, he understood. Something was coming. The next days became a blur of tension. The guards grew restless, drunker, meaner. Rumors spread through whispers and glances. The war outside had shifted. Borders were breaking. Orders had stopped arriving. The prisoners listened and waited. Freedom wasn't a word they dared to say aloud, but it hung in the air like the scent of snow before a storm. On the fifth night, it happened. The guards were celebrating something in the mess hall. Music, laughter, the clink of bottles. Pavel appeared at the boy's side in the shadows of the barracks. "Now," he whispered. The boy hesitated only for a heartbeat. They slipped out through the half-broken door, their breath white against the dark. The snow was falling softly, muffling their footsteps. They moved along the edge of the fence, toward the loosened post. Each second stretched thin as wire. Behind them, laughter echoed faintly. Ahead, the forest waited, black and endless. The boy dropped to his knees, pulling at the wire with shaking hands. It resisted at first, then gave way with a low creak. He froze. No alarm, no shout. Pavel crawled through first, vanishing into the snow. The boy followed, the metal tearing his sleeve, cutting his arm, but he didn't stop. The cold air on the other side felt unreal, like breathing for the first time. They ran, branches whipped their faces, snow swallowed their steps. The forest closed around them, vast and silent. They didn't speak for hours. They just moved, guided by instinct, fear, and the distant glow of the northern lights flickering above the treetops. When dawn came, they collapsed beside a frozen stream, gasping. The boy's arm throbbed from the cut, blood dark against the snow. Pavel tore a strip from his coat and wrapped it tight. "We did it," he whispered, almost laughing. "We actually did it." But the boy didn't answer. He was staring back toward the horizon, where faint black smoke rose like a ghost. He knew they would come. The guards would find the broken wire, the tracks, the trail of blood. They would follow. Freedom was never free. It came with a chase. They moved again, slower now, deeper into the forest. Hunger gnawed at them. Thirst burned their throats. Days passed like dreams, blinding white, endless cold, the sound of distant engines in the wind. Once they heard gunfire, far away, sharp and quick. Neither spoke by the third night. Pavel could barely walk. His face had gone pale, his lips blue. The boy half carried him through the snow, whispering the names like prayers, names of the dead, of those left behind, of those who still might live. "Keep them alive," he said, and Pavel smiled weakly. "You already have." When morning came, the forest thinned. Through the mist, they saw something, dark shapes, low roofs, smoke from chimneys, a village. They stumbled toward it, hearts pounding. But as they neared, the boy stopped. The buildings were abandoned, doors hanging open, windows shattered. The war had passed through long ago, leaving nothing but silence. They found shelter in a barn, collapsed beneath the hay. For the first time in months, the boy slept without chains or commands. He dreamt of Ilyan's voice, of warmth, of a sky without fences. When he woke, the light was gray, the air still. Pavel was gone. The boy sat up, panic surging, but then he saw it, a folded piece of paper beside him. The map, his map. Only now, there was something new drawn on it. A line leading farther north, ending with a single word, free. He stared at it, until the letters blurred. Outside, the snow had stopped. The wind had quieted. Somewhere far off, he thought he heard the faint cry of a bird. For the first time, he didn't feel afraid. He tucked the map inside his coat, stepped out of the barn, and looked toward the endless white horizon. There was no road, no sign, no sound, only the whisper of the forest and the promise that he was no longer alone. He began to walk. Each step felt lighter than the last. The sky opened above him, pale and infinite. Behind him, the footprints faded quickly in the snow, erased by wind, as if the world itself wanted to forget. But memory does not die, it waits, buried under ice, until the thaw comes again. The snow stretched endlessly before him, a white sea under a sky the color of steel. And for the first time in years, there were no shouts behind him, no chains at his wrists, no walls to mark the edge of his world. The boy walked for hours without knowing where he was going, guided only by instinct and the faint warmth of the rising sun. Every breath burned his lungs. Every step left a wound in the snow. Yet each movement felt like an act of defiance, a way of telling the earth he was still alive. He carried the map close to his chest, its ink smudged, the word free carved into his mind like a flame that refused to die. Days passed in fragments of hunger and exhaustion. He found water in frozen streams, food in what little bark and berries the forest offered, and shelter in the hollow of fallen trees. At night, he listened to the forest breathe, the cracking of branches, the distant cry of wolves, the wind whispering like voices of the dead. Sometimes he thought he heard Pavel's laughter echoing between the trees, or Ilyan's low, steady hum. He spoke to them both, not as ghosts, but as companions, and in those whispers, the silence felt less cruel. After what felt like weeks, the forest began to thin. The air softened, carrying scents he hadn't known in years: smoke, pine, resin, something warm and human. And then, one morning, he saw it, a road. Not the dirt tracks of the camps, but a real road, frozen hard and empty, leading toward a cluster of small houses at the edge of the trees. Smoke rose from their chimneys. For a long time, he simply stood there, staring, afraid it was another dream that would vanish if he moved. But the wind pushed him forward, step by step, until he reached the first fence. The village was quiet, too quiet. A dog barked once, then silence. He knocked on the nearest door, his hands shaking. It opened slightly, revealing an old woman wrapped in a thick shawl. Her eyes widened when she saw him, his torn clothes, hollow face, bleeding hands. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she stepped aside. "Come in," she said softly. Inside, warmth hit him like sunlight. The smell of bread made his knees weak. He tried to speak, but his voice cracked. She guided him to a chair, set a bowl of soup before him, and watched as he ate. "You came from there," she said finally, nodding toward the forest. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Her eyes were full of something between pity and understanding. "Many don't make it," she whispered. "You did." For 3 days, he stayed in that small wooden house. The woman, her name was Anya, said little, and he didn't ask questions. She lived alone, her husband gone to a war that never truly ended. The walls were covered in old photographs, faces of men and women in uniforms, smiles frozen in time. At night, she lit a single candle and sat by the window, staring into the snow. "They took everything," she told him once, her voice barely more than breath. "But they couldn't take the land. It remembers." He didn't understand then, but her words stayed with him. On the fourth morning, before dawn, he woke to find her gone. Only a note remained on the table beside the map: "Follow the river north." He stepped outside. The snow had stopped, the world wrapped in quiet light. He turned once toward the house, then began walking again. The river glimmered under thin ice, winding through the valley like a silver thread. Birds flew above, black shapes against the pale sky. Each mile felt lighter, though his body was weak. Somewhere ahead, there was supposed to be a town, one untouched by the camps, where travelers sometimes vanished into new names, new lives. By the second day, he reached it. A small place, half ruined, but alive, children chasing each other in the snow, men repairing roofs, women carrying baskets of wood. He stood at the edge, unsure, until a man approached, his coat patched, his beard thick with frost. "You're far from home," the man said, studying him. The boy hesitated. "I don't have one." The man smiled faintly. "Then you'll fit right in." He offered food, a place to rest in a barn by the river. The boy accepted. Days turned to weeks. He worked quietly, cutting wood, hauling water, mending fences. The townspeople asked no questions. They had learned long ago that questions were dangerous things. Yet he could feel the weight of their glances, their curiosity at the scar on his arm, the way he flinched at sudden noise. At night, he wrote. On scraps of paper, he wrote the names everyone he could remember from the camp, carved once in wood, now inked again in life. Sometimes he burned the pages after writing, watching the ashes float into the night sky, as if freeing their souls into the wind. Other times, he buried them beneath stones by the riverbank, where the current whispered forever. Then, one evening, as he walked along the water, he saw something that stopped him cold. A figure stood on the opposite bank, tall, wrapped in a coat too familiar to mistake. The scar, the limpet, was him, the commandant. The boy froze, heart pounding. The man didn't move, didn't reach for a weapon. He only looked at him, long and steady, then raised one hand, not in threat, but in something like acknowledgement. The boy couldn't speak. For a moment, their eyes met across the river. Two ghosts from the same grave. Then the man turned and walked away, vanishing into the trees. The boy stayed there until the moon rose high, the memory of that face etched in his mind. He didn't know what it meant: mercy, regret, or simply survival, but it told him one thing: the past never truly dies. It walks beside you, quiet as a shadow, until the day you choose to face it. Spring came slowly. The snow melted, rivers swelled, and the ground turned to mud. The boy, now no longer a boy, but not yet a man, watched the world transform. He began helping the villagers plant crops, fix roofs, rebuild what had been broken. The forest grew green again, the air thick with scent of pine and wet earth. Sometimes he caught his reflection in the river and hardly recognized himself. The hollow eyes were still there, but behind them burned something steady, something the camps hadn't killed. One evening, sitting by the water, he unfolded the map for the last time. The ink had faded, the paper soft, but the word free still stood clear. He smiled faintly, then tore it in half and let the pieces drift into the current. They floated away, spinning, until they vanished under the ripples. "It's done," he whispered. though he wasn't sure what he meant, the journey, the pain, or the need to remember. Maybe all of it. As the sun dipped behind the hills, he heard laughter from the village, the sound of life continuing. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, there was no sound of chains, no commands, no fear, only wind, river, and heart. Somewhere beyond the horizon, others were still trapped, still digging, still dreaming. He knew that, but he also knew that stories like his matter not because they changed the world, but because they kept truth alive. He stood, brushing snow from his coat, and looked toward the endless north, where the sky glowed faintly with the last colors of dusk. Freedom, he thought, was not a place or a word. It was a way of walking through the world and refusing to kneel. He took a deep breath, turned toward the village lights, and began to walk back each step, leaving no mark on the earth, yet echoing quietly, like the sound of cracking ice in the distance, announcing that the thaw had finally come. The summer came softly, almost shyly, as if afraid to disturb the land that had seen too much snow, too much blood, too much silence. The boy, now grown in spirit though still young in years, watched as the river thawed completely, turning from ice to flowing glass that caught the sun like a mirror. The village changed to fields bloomed with wildflowers. Children ran barefoot through mud, and laughter replaced the wind's hollow song. Yet inside him, the thaw was slower. Freedom, he learned, was not the absence of walls, but the burden of memory that refused to fade. Each night, he dreamt of faces, the men in the barracks, the guards' boots in the snow, the flicker of fire that had burned more than wood. Some nights he woke choking, tasting smoke that wasn't there. He had survived, yes, but survival was not the same as peace. It was a scar, invisible but always aching. He began walking to the river every evening, sitting on the same stone, staring at the water until dusk turned to dark. The villagers thought him quiet, strange, maybe broken. They didn't know that he was listening to the river, to the trees, to the faint echoes of voices carried by wind. He started writing again, not just names this time, but stories: how Elyon had once carved a spoon for a dying man, how Pavel had smiled when he said they'd make it, how a guard had slipped him bread once when no one was watching. Small things, human things, because that was what the Gulag had tried to erase, the small humanity that made suffering bearable. He wrote in secret, using scraps of paper, old journals left behind by soldiers long gone. His handwriting was rough, trembling, but steady. Each word felt like a heartbeat, each sentence a breath pulled from the frozen past. He didn't know why he wrote, only that he had to. Maybe to remember, maybe to forgive, or maybe because silence was a kind of death, and he'd already escaped that once. The villagers noticed his long walks, his quiet writing, the way he flinched when someone slammed a door. A few whispered rumors that he was a soldier hiding from the army, or a wanderer who'd lost his mind in the war. He didn't correct them. Truth, he realized, was heavier than any lie. One day, a stranger came to the villager man in a brown coat with ink-stained hands, claiming to be a teacher sent to rebuild the local school. He was polite, thin, with the tired eyes of someone who'd read too many truths and believed too few. The boy, curious despite himself, began to speak with him. At first, just short greetings, then longer talks by the river. The teacher listened more than he spoke, and that made the boy trust him. One evening, when the air was soft with the smell of pine, the boy handed him a small bundle of papers. "These," he said quietly, "are for those who can't speak anymore." The man looked at the pages, at the trembling words scrawled across them, and for a long moment said nothing. Then he nodded slowly. "People must know," he whispered. "If not now, someday." The boy didn't expect anything. He had written to unburden, not to be heard. But weeks later, the teacher returned with a small envelope and a strange light in his eyes. "They will print it," he said. "In secret, but they will." The boy stared, unable to breathe. "They'll read it?" he asked. "They'll know." The man nodded. "Yes, they'll know what they tried to bury." For the first time since leaving the camp, the boy felt something like hope, fragile, trembling, but real. He didn't think of glory, or revenge, or justice, only of the names carved in the bunk wood, the faces lost to snow. They would not vanish. They would live in words, in pages, in the hearts of those who'd never see the camps, but would remember their echoes. That night, he walked to the river and watched the stars reflected in its surface. They looked like souls, flickering but unbroken. He thought of Ilyan, of Pavel, of the old woman Anya, and whispered, "They'll know." The wind stirred the trees, as if answering. But the past had one last test to give. One afternoon, while chopping wood near the edge of the village, he saw soldiers on the road, gray coats, rifles slung across their backs, the same kind of faces he'd known too well. They stopped at the well, asked questions. Someone had spoken of an escaped prisoner, they said, someone matching his description. His heart froze. The villagers glanced his way but said nothing. Their silence was a shield stronger than walls. That night, he packed what little he had, the clothes, the notebook, the map fragments, and went to the teacher's house. "I have to go," he said. "If they find me, it's over." The teacher nodded sadly. "The story is already out," he said. "You've done what you came to do." The boy hesitated, then smiled faintly. "No," he said softly. "It's what they did. I just carried it." They embraced once, brief and wordless, like brothers meeting at the edge of war. Then the boy turned and vanished into the forest once more. He followed the river north again, the same path the old woman had shown him months ago. But this time, he wasn't running. He was walking toward something, not safety, not escape, but peace. The forest was alive with summer, the air thick with the sound of insects and the scent of wildflowers. He walked until his feet bled, until his breath became rhythm, until the noise of the world faded into a single thought: "They'll know." When he finally stopped, it was beside a lake, so still it looked like a mirror. He sat on the shore, opened the last blank page of his notebook, and wrote one sentence: "Freedom is remembering without fear." Then he closed it, set it beneath a rock, and watched as the wind rippled across the water, carrying the reflection of the sky. The sun was setting when he heard it, a distant rumble like thunder. He smiled faintly. Whether it was storm or war, it didn't matter. Life, after all, always began again with sound. He stood, turned once to look at the lake, then walked on, disappearing into the woods as night fell. And though his footsteps faded, the story he left behind kept moving through papers, through whispers, through generations yet unborn. For in every word, every name, every echo, of the Gulag. There lived a truth that could not be erased, that even in the darkest place, humanity endures. And as long as someone remembers, no prison, no empire can ever truly win. When the gates finally opened, there was no cheering, no grand announcement, no flag raised to mark the moment. It happened quietly, the way all endings do in forgotten places. The snow had begun to melt, turning the ground into rivers of brown slush that swallowed footprints before they could dry. A truck came one morning, its tires sinking into the mud, the engine coughing as though even it wanted to rest. An officer stepped out, holding papers that trembled slightly in his hand. The boy, now no longer quite a boy, stood among the prisoners as their names were read. One by one, some familiar, some belonging to men long dead. No one understood what was happening. The guards, stripped of their old fury, merely looked tired. The camp's silence had changed, was not the silence of fear anymore, but of disbelief. Then, as if carried by the wind itself, the word passed through the crowd: release. It sounded impossible. It moved through the men like fire, through dry grass, uncertain but unstoppable. Some laughed. Others wept without sound. A few simply stood still, too broken to react. The boy did neither. He watched the officer's lips move, the names tumble into the cold air, until his own appeared, a sound he hadn't heard in years, a sound that didn't even feel like him anymore. The paper was thrust into his hand, the ink already smudged by damp fingers, the seal of the state glaring up like an eye that had finally closed. He didn't thank anyone. He didn't know how. He simply turned, stepped beyond the line of the gate, and felt the world open up like a wound. The forest waited beyond the camp, black and endless. He walked without direction, his boots squelching in the thawing mud, each step heavy with ghosts. Behind him, the Gulag shrank into the mist, its fences dissolving into the horizon until it seemed almost unreal. For years it had been his world, his sky, his law, his prison, his home. Now it was nothing but distance. The air beyond smelled different, cleaner somehow, though it carried the same cold that had once bitten his bones. He thought he would feel joy, but what he felt instead was weight, a silence too deep to carry alone. Every sound startled him: the cracking of branches, the flutter of unseen wings, the soft hiss of wind weaving through trees. He had forgotten what ordinary noise felt like. When night came, he made a small fire beside a half-frozen stream and watched the flames sway. Their warmth frightened him. It was too alive, too free. He found himself staring into them the way he once stared at the camp's furnaces, waiting for orders that would never come again. Sleep refused to stay. Each time his eyes closed, he saw faces, the men who hadn't survived the winter, who had whispered songs under their breath before fading. Ilyin appeared most often, standing at the edge of the flames, the same calm expression on his face, the same quiet strength. "Don't waste it," the ghost said. "You walked out. Don't let them follow you inside." The man nodded, though there was no one to see. He realized then that the real prison was not the fence, but the memory that refused to die. Freedom wasn't something you reached. It was something you fought to keep breathing inside you. Days blurred together. He walked toward the nearest village, though he didn't know if it still existed. Once, he passed a group of farmers clearing snow from a road. They watched him approach, but said nothing. His coat was ragged, his eyes hollow, and his voice gone. When one of them finally spoke, it was in a whisper, "Gulag." He nodded, and the man lowered his gaze. They offered no food, no comfort, only silence. He didn't blame them. The world had been taught to forget people like him. In towns, he learned to walk quietly, to keep his head down. He traded a small carving, the last piece of wood from the camp, for bread and salt. The shopkeeper accepted it without question, tracing the marks on it with a curious sadness. He didn't know it was carved from a barracks beam, or that beneath the surface hid names of men the world had erased. Spring came slowly, reluctant and pale. The rivers began to move again, carrying fragments of ice like lost letters downstream. He followed one, walking until the smell of pine turned to soil and the trees gave way to open fields. Somewhere far behind, the camp still stood, empty now, perhaps already forgotten, its towers sinking into rot. He wondered if anyone would ever tell their story, or if time would bury them as quietly as the snow once did. The thought frightened him less than it used to. The boy who had entered that camp had been small, silent, afraid of everything. The man who walked out was made of ash and memory, stitched together by survival itself. He had learned that pain was not an ending but a language one only the living could speak. One evening, he reached a hill overlooking a wide, thawing plain. In the distance, a train crawled along a distant track, smoke curling into the sunset. He watched it for a long time, listening to its rhythm, steady and alive. Once, that sound had meant fear, deportation, the beginning of chains. Now it sounded like possibility. He sat on the grass, running his fingers through the damp earth, and for the first time since the fire, he smiled, small, cracked, but real. He thought of the word he had carved beneath his bunk. It had seemed foolish then, too fragile to survive. But it had followed him here, across years and silence and ice, and now it sat beside him, breathing with the wind. He never returned to the city. Instead, he found work in a small village, repairing fences, fixing roofs, building what others had broken. He didn't tell them who he was or where he had come from. When people asked about the scars on his hands, he only said, "Work." At night, he would sit outside his hut, carving again, not names this time, but shapes, trees, birds, rivers, flames, things that moved, things that lived. Sometimes he left them on doorsteps. Other times he tossed them into the river, letting the water carry them wherever it wished. It became his prayer, quiet defiance, a reminder that even the smallest pieces of wood could hold stories too heavy for words. Years passed. The world changed its flags, its rulers, its songs. People spoke of progress, of victory, of forgetting. But he remembered. He remembered not as a wound, but as a promise to never let silence win again. When he grew old, children in the village would come to his hut, drawn by the carvings that filled his shelves. They called him Dead Old Grandfather, though none knew his real name. He would tell them simple stories about stars and wolves and frozen rivers, never mentioning the Gulag, never naming the pain that shaped him. Yet sometimes, when the firelight flickered just right, they would see it in his eyes, the reflection of something vast and unbroken, like ice cracking under spring sun. One winter, he walked to the edge of the forest and stood for a long time, the snow crunching softly beneath his feet. The trees whispered in the same voice he had once heard in the camp, but it no longer frightened him. He smiled at the sound, placed his hand against a birch trunk, and whispered, "I'm still here." Then he left one final carving at its base, a small flame, carefully etched, forever burning in the grain. When spring returned again, the snow melted around it first, as if bowing in respect. Freedom, he realized, was not a door that opened once. It was the slow, endless act of choosing life after every silence. The Gulag had ended, but its shadow lived in memory, in wood, in wind, and, as long as he remembered, those who never walked out would not vanish. The world might forget their names, but the ice never would.